Well, it's another Monday, and today I'm going to hit you guys with a little bit of a primer on some power window tricks and stuff. This video, and I'm going to say this at the end again, is not going to tell you everything you need to know about power windows. Basically what it's going to do, it's a short primer, just like the slide says. Now, according to some of the online sources I found, Daimler first introduced electric windows in 1948, but the SAE timeline puts them in Lincolns in 1946. And these are the vehicles that, first had those. The first power windows I ever saw were in an old Chrysler that my dad had one time. I remember my sister and I were standing out there by that dusty old dirt road in front of that old farmhouse we lived in. And he had this black Chrysler that he had traded somebody out of. And whenever I turned around to look at the car, when the bus was coming up the road to pick us up, I saw that the windows were all going down and the antenna was going up. I thought I was about 6 years old. I thought that was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And I just kind of hated it that everybody on the school bus didn't get to see it too. But that was just a cool thing to me, first time I ever saw power windows on any car. Well, I see this all the time, and you probably do too, where and I've posted pictures like this before, where people have to pull up and open their door. Sometimes when my wife used to be a bank teller, and she would, before she retired, and she said that she would always see these people pull up that would have to open the door and get out of the car to do business because their power window was dead. And I see these particularly when I'm at the drive-through going to Hardee's or McDonald's or somewhere like that. This one here, I had posted a while back. I thought it was interesting. This is a Kia, if I remember right, or a Hyundai. I don't remember. I think it was a Kia. And both of the front windows, the one on this side and the one on the other side of the car, were both taped up with duct tape. And I don't know if they ever even checked to see how much it would cost to get the windows fixed, or if they hadn't got around to getting them fixed. These look like they've been taped up for a little while though, because of the wrinkles in the tape. But it's just really, it's a problem when the power windows go down. I mean, when I say go down, whenever they won't go down or when they fall down and it's about to rain, and I don't know how many times we couldn't get parts and we had to take a piece of PCV pipe or something, or wait a minute, PVC pipe, and notch it out on the top end and put it under the glass, cut it the right length to keep the glass up so it wouldn't rain in there until we could get the part that we needed to fix it. Whenever somebody was saying, well, what can I do? Because we order a window regulator, a motor, or whatever, and they wouldn't have it in stock nowhere in town, and they needed to take the car and they were going to bring it back. We just have the door panel off. Now, I'm going to mention this a little bit later, but before you pull a door panel off, you better look up and see how to do it. Now, there's a lot of YouTube videos that will tell you how to pull off various door panels and all that. But door panels, they make a neat little forked tool that you can buy at the parts store. If it's got the little Christmas tree retainers that go into those holes, you can pop that door panel off, but you got to go in there and find those. If you just try to jerk it off of there by hand, you're going to bust it. And some of the door panels, when you take the various screws out, they'll have 2 or 3 screws in various places. Usually one there by where you pull the door to close it, or it'll have a couple of them on either side of the strap where you pull it to close it. And sometimes on the very bottom of the door panel it'll have screws. You got to look really carefully. Sometimes they'll be hid up in a hole that's kind of obscured by some carpet that's in the bottom of the door panel. And so when you get those screws out of there, some of them don't have the retainers with little Christmas tree retainers. They just pick up and lift off of there. And so if you've got, make sure you know how to get the door panel off before you even attempt to do that, or you're going to cause yourself a lot of trouble. Door panels are expensive, or they can be. You can buy them on eBay, I guess. But one way or another, the first and foremost thing whenever you start fooling with that, make sure you know what you're doing when you get ready to pull the door panel off. It's not rocket science, not particularly dangerous, other than the fact that you could damage the stuff, but just be careful about that. Now, the old scissor type regulator with its curved rack and the spiral spring were not trouble free, but they didn't tend to fail quite as bad as these cable type. Now, I will tell you they were a lot harder to replace typically. Now on the Ford, and I should have put an illustration on this, Fords a lot of the times would have when you open the door panel, the screws that held the motor, the door center punched, in 3 places typically. And if you knew what you were looking at, if you needed to just replace the motor and you didn't need to pull the whole scissor top regulator out, you could just take your drill with the right size bit, so that you could drill a hole big enough for a 8mm or 5/16 socket to go through there, and you could drill those 3 holes where they had it punched, and you'd be looking right at those bolts. And then you take the bolts out and reach up in the door, and occasionally you had to pull the speaker out of the door to get up in there or something like that. But what tickled me was I was training this guy one time, and he was saying, well, I says, well, we're going to have to replace this window motor in this van. And nobody had been in there, so those little punch marks were there that you just barely could see. And I says, he said, well, how are we going to get to the bolts? You can't reach back up in there and get to those bolts. I said, well, I think if we drill some holes in the right place, we might be able to do it. And so I just picked up the drill, and to him it looked like I was randomly drilling holes just anywhere I decided to drill one, although he couldn't see the little punch marks. And I punched those 3 holes in there, and he put his head down there and looked through those holes, and every one of them had a bolt right behind it, and his eyes were as wide as the sun, and his jaw dropped. And then I had to show him on the opposite door where those punch marks were, so he wouldn't think I was some kind of a Superman or something. But anyway, you can notice how these switches are wired up here. Let me activate my little pin. Let's see, I'm going to do the pin here. All right, so you might notice that you got power coming through here down to the center of that switch. But when these switches are at rest, when this switch is at rest and this switch is at rest, we have got ground coming all the way through both switches to that motor, all the way through. Now, whenever you move the switch, this stays on ground while this one here moves over to power, and it starts to deliver power down one side of it, and that runs the motor one side. Now, this light up just right here is a built-in circuit breaker in the motor, just in case something, if the motor gets bound up or something like that, and somebody keeps trying to move it, that circuit breaker will open and close. Some of your headlight switches had circuit breakers too. Incidentally, on this spiral spring kind, if you've ever got one of these on the bench, you be really careful when you're taking that motor off of there, because that spring right there will be loaded, and it can whip that arm around there and smack you in the belly. And I'm speaking from experience here, because early in my career I had one do that to me. Just you got to make sure that spring is actually there to help the window go up, because the glass has some weight to it. Anyway, let's move on to our next slide now. Now, power windows started out as a simple up and down thing. They were fully electrical, but they didn't have any electronics. And the scissor style started to give way to cable and pulley systems in the 90s. And the cable and pulley system is pretty easy. It's fairly easy, doesn't cost a lot, easy to mount in the door. It makes the whole car lighter, because these don't weigh as much as the old scissor style. Some of the scissor style ones, though, were very annoying to me, because I would run into one occasionally on a truck that had a door that was flexing a little bit, like on a Ford pickup or something from back in the early 80s or something. And the window would bind up, and it wouldn't go anywhere, it wouldn't move, and it had the old scissor top regulator on. You could bang the door and the thing would start working. Well, but the next time it might not work until you bang the door again down there on the bottom close to where it was. And one time I had one that was given that problem, and I replaced the scissor top regulator with a brand new one. And the motor, there was nothing wrong with the motor, so I just put the same motor back on it, but it would bind up just like the first one did. And I don't know if I ever came to a conclusion. I lubricated everything and all that, and I think the problem wasn't as bad as it was, but sometimes he still had to bang the door to get the thing to work. Now, don't hit the motor with a hammer or anything trying to get it to work like you would a starter. Even if you hit a starter wrong, you can mess it up, because inside that shell on that motor is some little permanent magnets, and they're ceramic, and if you whack it too hard, you can break one of those permanent magnets, and then the motor turns into junk all of a sudden. But this was where they went. Now, these old switches were pretty cool. They had some of these terminals here that would, plug in, and that was what I was used to seeing back in the day on power windows. And for a long time they kind of looked like that, but they kind of went away from this after a while. You can buy, amazingly enough, you can go to Amazon and buy these power window switches for some of the really old cars. People have reproduction switches, or I don't know if they've rebuilt them or whatever they've done, but they typically want a lot of money for these things because they know they're kind of hard to come by, and somebody that's restoring an old Chrysler or something will pay for them, or an old Chevy or whatever. Now, the late 90s, Ford came out with this one-touch down thing, and that required it to have this solid-state black box. You know, don't you just love it whenever there's a black box that says solid-state, and too many times they don't tell you what's going on in that black box. And this right here, you got your standard circuit breaker in here and the motor. But what happens is whenever you just tap that button, this solid-state black box will let that motor keep going down until the current increases, and then it knows it's at the bottom of its throat. Now, the black box on this one-touch down does not do the one-touch up. It just does the one-touch down. You know, one-touch up was something they were kind of scared of for a while, probably because some kid's got his head stuck out the window and he's got his neck over that, and you do the one-touch up, and it, you know, if there wasn't some reason for it to check, they came up with a way to fix that. But I'm looking at some schematics here with you. This Honda had these little relays in it. And you know, this little 2-relay circuit, you know, it works like the switches did. Basically, when it's at rest, both sides of the motor are receiving ground. And whenever you energize just one of the relays, that relay delivers power to one side, and then the other side gets power whenever the other relay is energized. But notice it's got a driver's power window control unit. They can actually put some one-touch down and even one-touch stuff up in there. But basically, you might even notice that, see at this ground right here for the Windows motor, there's this little switch in here and all that. And so that basically, this thing is going to get an indication of when the motor is going. It's a 4-wire connector here. And so, you know, I didn't research these to tell you exactly how they work, but you can imagine how they work. It's going to need to know when the motor's down and when it's up. Now, a lot of the time, it depends on how they decided to do this. Sometimes they'll have a Hall effect switch in the motor. Sometimes they'll count commutator pulses. But that stuff has to be learned and stored in the computer's memory. And so there's just a bunch of different ways to do it. Now, this is an early Toyota. It's not a one-touch system. But it gives you a really smooth look at the driver door master switch and how it goes directly to the driver door motor. And then on the other side, it goes through this switch and through that switch. You notice it's a series connection right there on that. And that's basically what's going to give you your operation of that passenger side motor. And it works the same way if you got motors on the back, for the back windows and all that. Now, this is the 2015 Honda with automatic down and up. You know, they got some. You see the window circuit's getting more and more complicated as we go. There's a lot of wires here. You notice that thing right there has got 6 wires going to the driver's power window motor. One of the interesting things to me was some of the GM ones back in the 70s used to have a solid ground going to the motor all the time, and they had 2 different inputs for up and down. That was a strange thing. You didn't usually see that. I think some of the Oldsmobiles had that, or Pontiacs or something. I ran into those and had to troubleshoot them. But you can kind of see how this is going. All right, here's your 2020 Chrysler Voyager. Look at that. Look at this, driver's window up, driver's window down. Now, it's going to be, you're looking at this, you know that what this thing is going to be doing is it's going to be switching the polarity. And it's going to keep ground at the motor all the time and then switch the other one to power. But you're not seeing the circuit, how it works. But basically, they're telling you the driver master power window switch. If it's like typically on the Jeep that I had, the driver door module that controlled the door locks and all that was in the passenger door because it only had a couple of switches in it. The driver's door had lots of switches in it. So on that 2001 Jeep Cherokee I had, the driver's door module, the door module was on the passenger side, which I thought was very interesting on that. You don't usually see that. Usually the driver's door master switch has got most of the electronics in it. And a lot of these things have got computers built into the switches and all that. Now, this is a 2020 F-150. You might notice the front driver window switch has got a LIN bus, and it's basically going to send to the driver door module. See, that switch is separate from that driver door module. Ford likes to do that. They put the driver door module like on some of the old Lincolns and Crown Vics, they'd put a door module down in there in the door somewhere that would give you your keyless entry codes and all that kind of hogwash. And they like to have a module that was separate. The keyless entry modules on some of your pickups and other stuff and Expeditions would be a white box with a number on it that gave you your 5-digit permanent code, and it would be mounted up above the brake pedal or somewhere like that. If you could get a look at that number on there, you could get the permanent code off of it. And of course, you know, you don't use your permanent code for your entry code, you put a different one in there, but that's another story on how you do that. All right, so this 2006 Hyundai Sonata Auto Up basically measures the force that's required to raise it. And if you can put your hand in there and raise it up, and it'll go back, it'll hit it and go back down. You notice you got reverse protection and filter, signal filter and all that. This is an interesting circuit right here, I thought. This is called the safety window module. That keeps some kid from cutting his head off. I mean, this thing would be like a guillotine if it didn't have something like this. And you just got to hope it works right. The Hall effect sensor provides input to the ECU on the position of the glass. You notice there's a lot more to this power window motor than just the motor. When the battery's been disconnected for more than 5 minutes, though, the safety power window motor may need to be initialized. Now, we had a 2006 Sonata at the college that had been given to us by the factory back in 2005, whenever they first started building cars at that Montgomery plant up there. And we had the battery off of that thing and went dead a whole bunch of times, and I don't know that one ever lost its initialization. So, you know, showing somebody how to initialize it didn't really do anything for me. But what you're supposed to do is you start with the window in the full open position, raise it up, hold the switch to the closed position for like 0.2 of a second. That's not very much. Now, if you don't start in the full open position, this probably won't work. Fail-safe mode initializes when it's forced to move by something other than motor operation. The ECU knows from the Hall effect switch input the glass is no longer where it should be. Like if the gear is stripped or something inside. You know, on those Fords they had these little plastic pucks in between the center part of the gear and the outer part of the gear. And what it would do, sometimes those things would bust and crumble up, and whenever you go to raise the window, you'd hear the motor going tum 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 tum. And I would just take those gears out and pull them apart and drop a 1/4-inch nut in each of those places, put it all back together. You never have a problem again. You can buy one of those gears though. At the time they were like $18, and it was on a Ford though. But the ECU will enter fail-safe mode for the user's safety, and in fail-safe mode the window will go down, but only 20 millimeters at a time. Now you can plug in a new back glass motor on an Explorer Sport Track if you think you're going to work on that. I had a guy that I helped over there at the Ford place like that, named Andy, and he had plugged in a motor. He plugged in the motor to the wires and was just operating the switch, trying to get it to work. It wouldn't do anything. And so they said, can you go help Andy over there? And I said, yeah, I'll go help Andy. So I went over there, and what I found out was whenever you're replacing this motor, it's a smart motor. It's got some electronics in it. You have to initialize it. And so you got to complete steps 1 through 6 within 30 seconds. The whole procedure's got to be completed within 5 minutes or it'll drop out. Start with ignition off. You can freeze this slide if you want to. Turn on the ignition, press the power window control switch 6 times. This is something you wouldn't ordinarily do when you're driving the vehicle, right? Turn the ignition to the off position. The driver's door has to be open. Pay attention to all that. Press the power window control switch vent button 6 times. Now that's this switch right here that's right next to the radio, and one of them has got this, and this is kind of what it looks like. It'll turn either way, and you can push it too. All right, the power rear window will move down and up, press it 6 times, and after you've turned it off, it's going to move down and up 20 millimeters, and that indicates it's in initialization mode. Do you rotate and hold it to the closed position until the window stalls into the upper header seal. And see that it reads that increase in amperage, and that way it knows where it stops. Think about the way these air conditioner doors do in the dash, although they got they got some potentiometers in them a lot of the times, but not always. Momentarily rotate the switch to the open position and release it. It'll carry out a one-touch down operation and go to the bottom, and then you can see step 9. Just work your way through that, and like I say, you can freeze this slide and you can get an idea of how this is supposed to be done. And all right. Well, we did some work on an Avalon, had the battery disconnected for about a day. The customer came back for a couple of days, said his electric sunroof wouldn't work. what in the heck is this? You know, sometimes the customer comes back and says, hey, this doesn't work since y'all worked on it. You wonder, well, how could we have done that? But what we found out was the Avalon's got one-touch open and closed windows. Like most other modern vehicles, each power door window switch has a computer in it that's got to be reinitialized. And until you reinitialize all 4 of them, the sunroof won't work. Toyota does this kind of stuff. My son's got a 2020 Corolla that threw a code for the, you know, 128 or whatever it was for the engine running a little too cold. As long as that check engine light was on and that code was in there, his cruise control wouldn't work. But whenever he got an electric thermostat and swapped it out and put it in there and burped it out and got everything, the code was gone, he found out that the cruise control came back online as soon as the code wasn't there. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And Toyota did something similar here. They made it so that if you hadn't initialized all those switches, you wouldn't have sunroof operation, which I thought was pretty interesting. Well, one window at a time, you push and hold each power window switch to completely open the window, reverse the switch and raise it and hold it till the LED on the switch stops blinking and stays on. Test the operation of the window, test the operation of the sunroof. After you've done all 4 switches, until you've done all 4 switches, that sunroof stays offline. That was the experience we had on an 07 Avalon that we worked on. Now let's say the window doesn't move and it doesn't make any noise. All right, see that? If you operate the switch and the dome light dims a little bit, you can look at that the way that I made this light dim just for the, you know, illustrate that. I used to do that. You eliminate a whole bunch of tests that way. Whenever you operate that switch and no noise is made, you know, you can glance at that dome light and tell if you've pulled, if it's pulling current. If it's pulling current, you know there's power making it to the window and the window's bound up or something. If it doesn't, then you know you got some kind of an electrical open somewhere. But like I say, you've eliminated a whole lot of tests by pulling on that switch and looking at the dome light. I always love to do that kind of thing because if it's a go, no-go test, it's the one I want to use, you know, rather than going and digging in there and, you know, checking all this stuff. Let's just do the quick test and then we kind of know which direction to head. If the dome light doesn't dim, you need to check at the motor, which you're going to pull a door panel to do that. And you're supposed to find a ground at both power window motor connections with the switches at rest, because you remember that ground comes all the way through this switch and all the way to the motor. All right, so I actually drew it with a red line. I meant to draw it with a green one. The point is, I have seen, and you can have a situation where the passenger side door won't work with the passenger side switch, but it will work with the driver's side switch. And the problem can be the driver's side switch because of the driver's side not delivering ground to one side of the motor or the other. And so basically you got to make sure you're doing that. So you can basically determine that. I've actually run into that before where I would see one side would have a ground, the other side wouldn't. Both the switches would be okay, but I found a wire that was broke in between there, or push back pin or something like that. Now that's just really important. Now extra steps might be needed when you're replacing parts. If you buy a new driver door module for a 2004 Trailblazer, I found this out the hard way, it's not a plug and play part. A suitable scan tool is required to wake it up and marry it to the system before it'll work at all, because this is actually not just the power window switches, this is a driver door module, it's a computer. And I've seen, you know, you go online, you'll see people grousing about that because they'll buy the $200 part and when they plug it in, it won't work. And they think they've misfired on their diagnosis. Now nowadays, most invariably what we have is a motor that still runs, but the regulator that it's bolted to has turned into a mess. See all this cable's all busted up and everything. You'll hear a grinding or a crunching noise and the window won't move or it'll fall all apart of the way down. On my Explorer, I've noticed when I roll my driver's side window down, I'm starting to hear that crunching noise in there, although it's still going down and up okay. But I bought a regulator to have on hand just so I could pop one on there in case I needed to, because you know, having your, particularly in the winter time, if your window stops halfway down and won't go back up and you're on a trip, that's the worst of the worst. All right, so the new regulator on this Dodge Caravan has got like 2 tracks on it and all that. Looks kind of confusing and the cables cross and all that. Pay attention to how the other regulator was mounted before you pull it off and you'll do okay. And most of them go on there with bolts, but occasionally you're going to have one with rivets. Here was a one cable, you know, the regulator out of a Trailblazer, and that one there wound up with the cables, you know, came apart in the pulleys and all that. And so we just laid that busted up one in the box that the new part came in. And now this one right here, before the rivet is popped, like on your Fords, you're going to have these 1/4-inch pop rivets. And if you're gonna, before you drill one of those out, and a lot of times the regulator will come with bolts and nuts so that you could put those in there. But you're going to need to get a punch that's the right size and punch that what's left of this this thing here when this pop rivet gun bunches that up so that the rivet's real solid and all in there, and it'll still hold even as this thing's not there, this part right here. But you want to punch that out before you drill it, because if you start trying to drill it out without punching this center out of it, and you just so that there's a nice little hole there, you're going to have some issues trying to drill it out without making a mess. All right, so make sure you do that. Now, if you're not familiar with pop rivets, they ain't rocket science. There ain't a lot to them, and you can buy a really nice big pop rivet in tool. I mean, this thing's long. It's probably about a foot and a half, 2 feet long, and it's really strong. And it's got different size ends on it. And you notice this one here is a Harbor Freight one, and whenever you pop this off, it actually catches these when they come off of there. And so that it catches them in a little bucket. Most of them don't. They just let it fall out on the floor, the ones I've used. But these are 1/4 inch. They go in a 1/4 inch hole and all that, and you got to drill them out. If you're going to put bolts in there, that's fine, but you better put some kind of Loctite on them or something. One of the reasons they put rivets in there is because bolts tend to work loose if they're going through stuff. You got to take the glass completely out of the door after you've drilled the rivets out that are holding it on the Crown Victorias and the Lincolns and all that, and then lay it. You get a piece of cloth and lay it on the hood, and then lay the window up there on the hood, and then get your window regulator put back in there, because the top's got a couple of studs you got to bolt in and all that kind of thing. And before you put the door panel back on, make sure that the darn thing works right, so that if anything's out of line or it's not working right, or if maybe the gear is rubbing against a wire harness or something like that, you can spot that while you got the door panel off. But make sure you put that moisture barrier back on, because that moisture barrier is really important to keep the inside, the side of the door panel that's between the door and the panel. You don't want that to get moldy and mildew and stink the car up. And because back in the day, some of you older guys, or if you've worked on older cars, you remember that the door panels were made out of something kind of like cardboard. And if you got that stuff a little bit wet, it was junk. There was a Lincoln one time that had walnut inserts on the door panels that was starting to buckle up and peel off, and the guy was initially just said, I want my door panels replaced, and when I told him that the door panels were $1,500 a piece, he decided that he didn't need those as bad as he thought he did. But anyway, that moisture barrier is really important. Now, some of them you got like on some of your Dodge Calibers, I think, and this one here is for a Volkswagen. They'll have an entire panel that's complete with a regulator like you see here, and that's pretty handy because you can take that panel off and see inside the door and all that. Nothing wrong with that. Pretty cool the way they got it done. Now there are some steps you got to go through, and I didn't go through all of those. But we didn't cover everything about power windows that you could possibly ever need to know, because it's not possible to do that in a 30-minute video. But let me know if this helped you, and I really appreciate you guys watching the video, and I hope you'll come back next week.